Hello, extempers, speech and debaters, and everybody else listening to this podcast. Welcome to the 21st episode of the Half Hour. Today, we're going to be talking more COVID, but there's a fun little twist because it's not just COVID, but more so what has the effects of COVID done to our society? Specifically, what has it done to our school district? And because we are a speech and debate team within a high school, we obviously had to talk about this topic, especially as it relates to Extemp and the questions that you're going to get about education, specifically this year. But as always, I'm YuYu.
And I'm Spencer.
And welcome back. Thank you all so much for listening to all of our episodes. We've been kind of, squeezing them down to 35 minutes or so. And I think that's been working well with our listeners. I hope you're taking a lot from our episodes, and we just really appreciate the support and the love that we're getting from each and every one of you. And this is like a good place to also say that, just kidding, we're not talking about education. We're going to talk about Russia and Ukraine. No, that's going to be for next week. So a little spoiler alert. If you're a PFer, if you're an extemper, go listen to next week's video. Go listen to next week's video and also podcasts to get more information about Russia, Ukraine, and how it relates to NATO and Turkey.
We're kind of waiting on the Russian-Ukraine. A couple of reasons. We typically are in essence, a week behind when it comes to all of these big news topics. And while this kind of happened at a good time for our recordings, the one thing is there is going to be a lot of buildup in the coming weeks, and we really do want to cover the most that we can around the situation and give some good information. I think Russia and Ukraine is probably going to be a longer episode because there is a lot to talk about because this is a conflict that's been kind of in the making for at least 3-4 years and has some pretty important background to hit and cover. So we're waiting on that episode. Right now, you're going to get a U.S. topic on COVID and education, which is probably just as important. It's in YuYu. Before we even get into this topic, we haven't even talked about education yet, which is really weird for our podcast.
True.
The fact that we haven't even gotten into this topic area is actually kind of sad. And it's not sad for us. It's just sad that we haven't really thought about it because it is a pretty big issue that continuously makes the news.
Yeah. And I think just as the nature of politics in general, and this being a very heavily politics dense podcast for high schoolers and anybody else who listens, education tends to get weeded out. Like I said, same can be said in politics. We know it's an important part of constructing our society and making sure that the next generation can move us forward into the future. But we also always tend to forget about education in terms of just giving it more attention, giving it a little bit more love so that our next generation can have the ability to carry us forward into the future and make sure we don't all die in the process. But yeah, today is going to be a little different. I'm actually going to start my little spiel about education just because Spencer didn't want to give background. But in terms of that, my part isn't even really background, is in the history of the United States education system. I feel if I was going to talk about that, this episode would be an hour long. So go research that on your own time. Again, this is just a resource to help you out, not necessarily here to construct your whole speech. Okay, so education in respects to COVID-19. Of course, COVID has been challenging to all of us. And while we know that hospitals are very short-staffed, employees are still drained from being overworked and underpaid still, I would say that the second public industry that has taken a massive hit is the education sector. Again, this isn't surprising because, as we all know, as students ourselves, a part of this education system that we had set up, what we had set up before was already very bad or failing. And COVID just kind of exacerbated those existing issues. But let's dive into that a little bit. So obviously you have complaints from students and adults alike, They range from lack of engagement and the discontent with the ways that schools are ran. And the school system isn't even a major US issue that policymakers and arguably just people in general tend to care about, as we've talked about before. And as a result, it gets heavily ignored and is the reason why our school system is very outdated and unable to meet the needs of students. Even through the articles that I was reading, they tend to frame it in a way that, yes, it's bad for school, but also it's very bad for Democrats because this means they could lose some of their votes in these states. And they tend to ignore that conversation about how, because of lack of resources for schools, it negatively affects our kids. But of course, these issues always arise when we consider all schools as equals, as in like lack of resources, lack of like engagement among the student body. But also, in reality, we all know that schools just entirely on its own are unequal. And what I mean by that is that there are massive disparities between schools individually, whether it's because of a lack of funding or the inability to get resources. There is inequality in schools, which is also associated with societal inequality, just generally. And I think to tie in just like some background information about how funding for schools work, it's not really determined by like the United States federal government. It's determined by either your state. Some people do it by like population of localities. It all depends on like where you are in terms of how you get funding for education. So those inequalities were only exacerbated when COVID hit and schools needed other ways to be effective at teaching. So while private schools, some charter schools, and some public schools had the ability to work around the pandemic with access to Zoom, access to technology, and workspaces that had like Wi-Fi and everything needed to be successful, other public schools that lacked that funding, especially those in lower income neighborhoods, didn't have access to most of those resources at all and couldn't help students by lending them computers, Wi-Fi access, or even a safe workspace because they didn't have the funding necessary to provide that to them. So while on the individual level, some schools were fine, on the collective level, many schools suffered. And as a result, student education and learning proficiency, also mental health, also suffered. The pandemic has changed our perception of the role of school, I would say. From it, we've recognized the US labor force relies heavily on the education industry to teach and also take care of our kids while parents go to work and are away from home. And also, education works heavily to shape the next generation. This causes us to kind of reevaluate the school atmosphere that we've really built up. And COVID has kind of like forced us to reconsider what kind of atmosphere we've built and really question where we've gone wrong and why it's so important that we talk about how to make our school system better. This brings in ideas of like counseling resources and a creation of an emotional support system for our schools so that kids feel more comfortable and can talk about their issues related to mental health. It also brings in more attention to the safety of schools, where despite finally being able to go back to school, and this might be like a trigger warning, but like teachers, students, and parents still have to worry about the threat of school shootings in a place that is supposed to be considered safe and protected. And this has been very heavily on the minds of children because not only are they suffering psychologically from having to deal with COVID restrictions and the like for their own safety, but now they also have to worry and be anxious about not being protected in the place where they're supposed to be protected from like school shooters and stuff like that. And that also sparks a conversation with like, well, if we provide more mental health resources and create a safer environment, there's a less likely chance of school shooters even being able to be in that situation where they are. And so this all kind of like ties together in terms of what we can work on to make our schools better. But as you can guess, many of these grievances haven't been addressed. And it has caused a shortage of teachers as a result because of the emotional baggage that they've had to deal with through the COVID-19 pandemic. And if it's not teachers quitting because of that emotional baggage, it's the lack of safety measures in these schools for COVID that has caused sicknesses of staff and caused like a staffing shortage as a result of that. And when that happens, you have states like Texas and Utah asking parents or even employees of different businesses that's not even school related to come substitute for a teacher that is out sick or that just like needs a mental break from it all. And obviously, there's a lot of problematic things to say about that just because they don't have like the experience there. And I'm sure all of us can relate to that one sub who didn't know what they were doing. And we were kind of like, well, whatever. I guess I don't have to care either when they're there. So just considering the effects of that on kids and their ability to be engaged and learn throughout school. So suffice to say it seems like the education system has really taken a huge hit and fallen off in terms of like where we were before COVID-19 and also like where we were after COVID-19. And it's not even after COVID-19 yet. So like consider that too. And the last thing I really want to do is to address the ability of these schools to address safety concerns over COVID. Spencer will deep dive more into that later. But for high school level, some school districts are arguing with the PTA or their faculty about how to go about creating a safer environment and dealing with COVID-19 in school so that they could be in person. Most people don't like the idea of a hybrid option because that means they have to go on Zoom again. And if you're considering that, most people don't like the idea of wearing masks in school because then it covers up your face, or just people don't like the idea of masks in general. And on top of that, you have parents who also fight against vaccinating their own kids because they don't believe in the vaccine and its effectiveness and think it's very dangerous. And all of these ideas that we've talked about in a previous episode about COVID-19 really is exacerbated here and creates a very weird space where we want to be helpful. We want our kids to be in schools, but we're not willing to take those measures and parameters to make it safe so that kids can return back to schools. And this is where we are. And I'm sure Spencer has like more to say about these disparities and what it's really like.
Absolutely. And from where you left off, it's a very good transition. There's some really good material that I'm going to talk about later too, pertaining to education and kind of what we know about educational funding. I'm not going to get there yet. That's a better hint for one of our questions coming up. I'm going to cover the cause and effect portion because I've been paying a lot of attention to this in the news, and I know quite a bit about this. And education is one of those top issues that really needs to be discussed a lot more. But when you look at education, you have to make sure that you understand specific cities, because the biggest cities that pertain to education help us into understand, or that are monumental for education and kind of what's going on, are important for driving how education goes across the country. And that's really what we're going to pay attention to. We're not just going to look at, we're going to look at two major cities in this podcast. And then we're going to hit on some higher education stuff because higher education does still kind of fall in U.S. education. And you may end up with questions about higher education or college education pertaining to COVID-19. So it's really important to understand at least a little bit. Our questions won't hit higher education. I'm just going to lightly tap them over. This section is going to cover four major parts. We're going to talk about the city of Chicago. We're going to hit New York as the two like big cities right now that's driving teacher unions in the nation and really where education is going. And then we're going to hit on two universities. First one is Stanford. Shout outs to YuYu. The other one is going to be the University of Wyoming. Shout outs to me. Hey, we're going with anecdotal stuff, so there won't be any sources for this. So, and once again, I would make that argument that higher education does fall in this topic. Let's start with Chicago. This is maybe the biggest issue that's hit the news. And it hit a lot of news stories. It's a pretty big problem and actually shows maybe that teacher unions are going to see some reformation over the course of this upcoming summer. And what happened was there was a dispute in the city of Chicago with the Chicago Teachers Union. That is called the CTU. The agreement between the CTU and the mayor had come after a massive dispute on COVID-19 protocols and having students in school. The CTU had led itself to a lockout that lasted nearly a week at the start of the term for 2022 from Mayor Lori Lightfoot because of problems persisting to the coronavirus pandemic. The president of the CTU, Jesse Sharkey, noted a blame at the mayor, explaining, quote, "It's outrageous that teachers, school nurses, counselors, and more had to endure a week of being locked out by the mayor just to get a commitment from her bargaining team to provide every student with an N95 mask in a pandemic." The agreement that was eventually came to by both sides kind of has created a new situation. At the start of the first day when students returned to school, students were faced with one of two situations. They were either going to be reporting to the auditorium or learning remotely because the teacher was out. And that just goes to show that even with the Chicago Teachers Union passing and approving what happened, it wasn't enough, and that teachers are still kind of protesting what's going on, because the vote only passed with 55.5% approval in Chicago, and only 70% of the CTU actually voted in this. And that brings up a probability that Chicago's teacher union may face radical revisions, probably either this year or in the upcoming years, as teachers are really uncertain about the union's current stance with Lightfoot's advising team and the current protocols that are in place. One thing I want to point out is Chicago's got some very odd rules, and the CTU is actually not allowed to host a strike due to certain rules and regulations. And because of this situation, I also want to note that you should maybe expect a CTU topic to come up a little later, because we're sure that this is going to have something important as we go down the road. New York. New York also happens to be another hot topic when we are discussing education. This time, there is uncertainty about the idea of going remote compared to the idea of COVID protocols. The new mayor for New York, Eric Adams, wants to ensure that schools stay open during this time, saying that the safest place for students to be is in the classroom. The statistics he had provided is that 22,000 of New York's nearly 1 million students had tested positive. 15% of those were from students who stayed home, and 1% of those were from students who were in school. But the average class attendance in New York has been at least 77%. Remember, these are Eric Adams' numbers. City officials are actually unsure as to why the number of students are staying home. Questions can range from the number of cases and being concerned to the pandemic, all the way to remote learning maybe being easier for the students. But the process that they want to do with online school is kind of being debated upon. In the past, New York has resorted to what is called the academy approach, which is an approach that has teachers who are qualified to teach online courses to teach them. They would teach students in groups of 6 that would depend on grade or possibly subject matter, which I would argue is a very smart system for online school, but that's just me. Mayor Adams insists that New York has its schools open despite the surges that exist with the coronavirus pandemic. Now to a little bit of higher education stuff. Once again, this is anecdotal. There won't be any sources from it. This is just based off of our experience. And we're going to start with Stanford, which particularly affects YuYu. And as we know, Stanford decided that it was going to be online for school for at least a solid 4 weeks before changing to in-person. One thing that is important to note is Stanford is on a quarter-based system because of California law. We understand that online school may sound easier, but the truth is that it can be more stressful. Additionally, it can make some assignment and instructor expectations significantly harder. While reverting to online is a good option, that does not mean that it is the most productive option. Online exams, when have strict monitoring, can become more difficult for the issues to become resolved. As for the University of Wyoming, I'm actually pretty surprised by this, but UW has been moving forward with in-person learning. While this may seem like a good thing, the problem is that students may need to be online and could see negative impacts to their potential learning in the long run. The other negative to what the university has been doing, or to what UW has been doing, is that departments are given the choice of how they wish to handle the pandemic. And let me make sure I'm clear here. There is still mask mandates that have to be required by all departments, etc. But some majors, such as the political science major, which is my area, are continuing to hold classes online due to the pandemic. So it's uncertain based off of majors. It's causing people to change majors, change ideas of what they want to do, because some people just don't like doing online courses. But it also can create some opportunity. The problem with the political science major at the University of Wyoming is that it's always struggled with having people graduate. And the reason why is because you have all these people who are online, and then there's a requirement of having a political science seminar, which has always been in person. But the pandemic has created that opportunity for online politics majors to be able to complete their major as such. And now there is the opening for more seminars to be conducted online and for people to be able to complete their degree. So while this was never the case beforehand, this actually is a very good thing for some people who want to pursue online education. And YuYu, while we can look at the pandemic as being a pretty negative thing in terms of education, there can be its benefits if conducted right.
Yeah, I agree with that. And just like a correction, we only went 3 weeks online for undergrads at least. And then the fourth week we started in-person classes. But one of my like classes, we had to go online because of like COVID concerns. So we should be in person next week. But I do agree that like in order for online school to be effective, you need effective ways to conduct it. And if you don't have that effective way to conduct online teaching, then it kind of loses its purpose of just teaching in itself. So I would say like the way that my language classes are conducted over Zoom is pretty effective. We're pretty engaged. We can like understand what's like going on. And we also see through like screen share, I guess, the different characters that we're supposed to learn for like Chinese language. I know I'm Chinese, I'm learning Chinese language, don't question it. But yeah, if you do conduct it in that way where it is effective and like people are learning and you're constantly receiving feedback on how to be better, then I would feel like that's a more effective way to go about it. But if you don't, and you're just like there to be there, but you don't want to be there, then obviously it's harder. And you can like question the effectiveness of it generally because people are more inclined to talk to each other in person sometimes. But also some people thrive over online classes more than they would in person too. So you can take that into consideration.
With that said, let's go ahead and jump into the questions. And we'll go ahead and start with the first one here. And this is, will public education be the biggest victim of the COVID-19 pandemic? And I think we have answered that in this podcast already. But I'm going to add a little bit to this. And this is kind of where I wanted to add with what YuYu was talking about earlier with funding. To explain, funding is typically done through a local government. What happens is local taxes are collected every year in a city, and that government takes that money and distributes it to schools. Okay. The state of Wyoming is different than that. It is based off of state government. And the reason why is because if it was collected through local tax, there would not be enough money to fund the schools. So the state of Wyoming is very different in comparison to that. I think all the states follow the local tax other than Wyoming. I may be wrong on that, but it's typically local taxes. So what that means, they have school in these cities. They have schools that are located in different areas. Okay? There is a school that's maybe located in typically or in a neighborhood that may not have the best living situations, where it might be very low income. There's probably high crime, what people would consider as that. Then you have schools that are in maybe more middle class areas and schools that are in higher end areas. And the problem that exists is when local taxes are distributed, they're going to be distributed based on where each of these schools are. And that means that the school that's in the lower income neighborhood, unfortunately, gets the lowest amount of funding. So the problem with education is not necessarily the education part to it. And that the problem really resounds around living situations. Okay, what sociologists note is that the fact that when you go into a city and it's broken into a lower income area, a middle class area, and an upper class area, the fact that they're not intertwined and diverse is what causes education to fall. Okay? And that's one of the reasons why the pandemic has really exposed this problem. And that's why I would make that argument of yes, COVID-19 is one of the biggest victims. I would make sure that and I'm going to say one of the biggest victims. I don't think it is the biggest victim though. I think personally we have to remember that people have died from this pandemic. Hospitals are like saying that education is the biggest victim, I think is a little bit of a stretch, but it certainly is one of them. And I think that's a pretty fair point. But what's been really exposed with this is the fact that neighborhoods are diversified based off of income, which causes certain people's education to be less. And that is not a good thing. What needs to happen is finding a way to diversify a neighborhood and having a neighborhood where lower income people can live next to upper income or upper class individuals, and middle class individuals are all mixed within each other. And that would provide the most equal and most fair education. That just doesn't happen right now. And I think the pandemic has really exposed that problem. And that's really the issue that's at hand. But I think saying the biggest victim, like that is a stretch. Like that is I don't like that choice of wording, but has COVID like really impacted education? Yes.
Yes. I would agree with Spencer. I don't know about education being the biggest victim of COVID-19. I think it is arguably either hospitals or the people who have dealt with a lot of loss from COVID who have been the biggest victims of COVID-19. In terms of education, though, I just want to piggyback off of what Spencer has already said. It's not that COVID-19 has caused this disparity in schools. It's that COVID-19 has worsened the disparities in schools that existed prior to COVID, like in this whole pandemic. And that's very important to take note of because it is a COVID separate issue. So while we frame it through a COVID type lens, it's not that directly linked to it. And what I really just want to emphasize here is that take note of how this education inequality is a social problem. Like it's not necessarily economics or like money created. It's a social problem because not only are these neighborhoods who are lower income, they can't have enough money to like fund the education system and like give enough resources to those schools so that they're successful. But also it dates back to our history about segregation and how we like segregated white kids from the Black community and how that kind of just also ties into the way that our education system is ran now, in which you see in lower income neighborhoods, you have either predominantly Black students or predominantly white students in like a middle class neighborhood or in like a higher up neighborhood and stuff like that. And like that disparity is what also makes it such a social issue and reinforces this, reinforces this kind of like racist system that has been created due to history and also due to the fact that inequality had already existed prior. And so these are the kinds of issues that you should also be thinking about in terms of how COVID has affected schools and if you get a question like this. And so that's just to say that education did take a really big hit because it wasn't set up to kind of encounter the situation or to like deal with the disparities that were going to be worsened through this pandemic. But it's not the biggest victim of COVID-19 because this is an issue separate from COVID. Okay.
And I want to add something before we go to the next question. I completely agree with that. And I've actually put in our sources a book called Savage Inequalities by Jonathan Kozol. This is one of the best books I've ever read. It is very, very good. And what it discusses is how we all know the very famous Supreme Court case of Brown versus the Board of Education. It explains how even after that happened, schools were still segregated. And that's because of the neighborhoods. That is because of really residential and living areas, right? We understand that this disparity has existed for a long time and is still not solved, even through unconstitutional rulings, even through even if we can try to help these lower income neighborhoods that are predominantly people of color. It's not solving anything. And that is a problem. It's a very big problem. That book does a very good job. It's basically Kozol wrote it in 1992, and I think it would still apply 30 years later. This is a really like impactful book. And basically what he did was he went to different cities to talk with students and teachers and observe classrooms. And all that book is writing what happened. That's it. And the point of the book is to show that what has been ruled as unconstitutional is unfortunately still seen in today's society. And we haven't been able to solve the problem, and we still need to fix it. As the title insists, it's basically savage inequalities.
Yeah. And I don't know if it's much of like we haven't been able to fix it or we won't. Just because of like all the rhetoric that we have and like you see with what's been happening in terms of just racism in America, like that's very predominant and it affects the way that our policy happens. And as a result, it trickles down into very different aspects of our lives that we might not even consider that it trickles down into. But with that, you can move on to the second question of, will American schools struggle to assemble enough staff to operate in 2022 and 2023? Yeah, like again, we've answered this question throughout the whole podcast in that we talked about how now they're struggling to even staff with substitutes as the lack of COVID safety restrictions has caused many teachers or even students to fall sick with COVID. And because they don't want to spread it to every single person in the school, they obviously have to quarantine, in which you need substitute teachers to take their place so that they can keep classes going. But again, low morale really on teachers, causing a whole bunch of them to either retire early or to quit the job and look for another profession, especially with the low wages that they were already paid in the first place. It doesn't look very appealing to kind of seek that job out. But on top of that, not only are you not having enough workers to work the schools and to be at the schools, you're also not adopting enough like safety restrictions or like a better model in order to conduct school so that you don't have this loss of teachers and need to find like more substitutes to come and like run the classrooms. But so I think it's pretty obvious that like American schools will struggle to assemble enough staff to operate in 2022 and 2023. And this isn't just like teachers. This also just goes to staff generally. And this is something that I haven't like really talked about, but it does reach out to staff members like cafeteria, lunch ladies, or to like cafeteria people in general. But this also reaches out to the janitors that are a part of the school too, in which if they fall sick, it's kind of hard to like clean some schools. I've heard stories where literally there was only one working bathroom in school because all of the janitorial staff had either quit or came down with COVID and couldn't come to work. And this disparity just highlights how much America is struggling in terms of staffing their schools correctly.
I don't know if I fully agree with your answer. And I think it's a real possibility that schools will struggle to operate. And the staff stories, yes, they are true. We've heard about these, okay? But that comes back to the point that I made about the Chicago Teachers Union. We're probably going to see a lot of union stuff over the summer. And like now is a really good time to start talking about that. And I think if unions can come to a agreement, then I think we're going to be safe. I think that American schools will be able to operate, but it really depends on that. It depends on how successful unions can be in that terms. Obviously, in Chicago, they had to debate the mayor for a week to get schools to operate because they can't come up with COVID protocols. Okay? And even then, once again, that was passed very slim. So what's probably going to happen is you're going to have a revitalization of the CTU. And then on top of that, once the teachers union has been reestablished in some way, you're going to also have new negotiations and new protocols and new bargaining agreements, which can make it difficult for any operation to occur by the time the school year starts. So that like 3-month break for school could turn into a complete and utter mess of time. I personally think that schools can operate in 2022 and 2023. It just has to be in hopes that unions make the changes they need to make. And if there's, I don't think there's much more to say than that. I think unions are going to play a pretty big role this summer. And it's going to be, you're going to see a lot of agreements made. I think there's a possibility that we see another teacher strike. I think that a lot of the issues pertaining to COVID is going to be revealed through the teachers unions. And I think Chicago will probably be like the heart of that. And we should be really paying attention to what unions are going to do with that over the summer. Also, hence back to the MLB lockout podcast where we talked about unions and how unions are beginning to play a pretty big role. And now we're probably going to see this happen again. So unions are very important. I do think that even though the CTU is not allowed to strike, I think that there is a possibility that a strike does somehow happen.
That you mentioned it, just not necessarily like strikes happening, right, in order to cancel school from happening. But an article from the New York Times that I just kind of Googled in the midst of this podcast talked about how 3 weeks ago, Chicago had canceled schools that were in clash with teachers' unions, basically through the idea of like labor shortages and how they couldn't function because they didn't have people to work in the schools. And so I still think you say yes to this question of will American schools struggle to assemble staff to operate in 2022 and 2023, just because we are living through that moment right now. And whether or not they can gain a concession is still questionable. Like, we don't know if they can gain the concessions needed in order to fix what's been broken for a very long time. Like, it took a lot of effort, strikes even, in order for certain states to get a raise in teachers' pay. It also took a lot just to get COVID safety restrictions. And I think that just highlights how, while unions can have an effect in improving labor and improving like labor rights and also like what you can get when you work, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can boost morale through that way, because the changes that are made through unionization can be oftentimes very slow. And if this is a time frame of just between the years of like 22 to 23, then those effects can still linger on and we can still struggle to find staff for these schools. And like obviously just generally living through the pandemic and not seeing the end of the pandemic yet, that's also going to affect the ability of us to staff our schools too.
I think the answer to this question ultimately depends on, do you think unions are going to get it done over the summer? And like I said, I think there's the possibility. And I think that you can take the optimistic approach and say that they can find it. Okay, I think Chicago is a pretty good example of it maybe not happening. Okay, but I certainly do think that we are going to see a massive number of teacher strikes. And if that's not the case, I would be shocked right now, because the amount of teachers that are quitting is just ridiculous. It's so far up. It's basically like not even a joke right now. Like teachers want to be safe from everything that's going on, but I don't think you can fully answer yes yet. I think if this was like a question that was maybe a month before the school year started, we at this point in time, maybe I would be fully sold on it. But if the unions were smart, they would start negotiating for that year, for the year now. Obviously, they're probably not going to do that because most of the people in the teachers' unions are teachers. So, and they're going to focus on teaching classes and grading work. So it's kind of like I think it's up to you of how you want to go about answering this. Do you think the unions are going to get it done quickly? Or do you think the unions are going to be in a standstill? And I think that's a really like good point to make here is like, I think this question really revolves around, can the unions get what they need to get done?
Agreed. Suffice to say, we've like talked a lot about the doom and gloom of the whole situation of the education system in the US. But I do want to reiterate to like keep your optimism and like keep hope. Obviously, stay in school, get your education. And that's obviously really important to your development as a person, coming into society and making society better. So please stay in school. But because it's been such an issue that's like such a big issue that's been brought to light recently, we can probably start to see some progress being made in order for change to happen. And so keep a lookout for that. That's what we do as extempers and people who keep up with current events and news. So yeah, I don't have anything more to add unless Spencer does. But in that case, thank you so much for listening, watching, supporting the channel, supporting the podcast. I hope you get the one around. If you don't, let us know how you did. Let us know to DM either our Instagram, the Half Hour Extemp Podcast, or me or Spencer on Instagram. We're available almost 24/7 if we had enough caffeine in our system. But if you are not subscribed to our YouTube channel, please do. If you're listening through the podcast right now, I want you to go to our YouTube channel, hit the subscribe button, ring the bell so you get notified of our episodes. I believe we come out earlier on YouTube. If not, it's okay. Just watch our fun expressions and our beautiful faces because we want you to. But anyway, thank you so much for listening. Please tune in next week on Ukraine and Russia, and we'll see you then.
Thank you all so much for watching. And until next time, we'll see y'all later.